I really didn't want to make this video. But the more I think about it, the more seriously I reflect on it, the more I realize that I really should. Obviously, I've been away from YouTube for quite some time. In that time, I've received quite a few inquiries. People have asked me why it is that I no longer make videos. They've asked me to continue making videos. They've offered me suggestions on topics on which I could make videos. And they've just generally asked me all sorts of questions about all sorts of topics. And to be frank, I really am not sure what to make of all of this. I'm not sure how to deal with it because apparently all of these people see something in what I had been trying to do or what I had been doing on YouTube that I just don't see. However, given that I've gotten as many inquiries as I have, I do feel that I have a duty to, at the very least, sit down and explain to all of these people why it is that I haven't been making more videos. Now, there are basically two reasons why I've been away. A short reason and a long reason. And the two reasons play into one another and play off of one another dialectically, and so when I explain what they both are, you'll be able to see a kind of broader picture of the whole situation. Now, the short reason is that I simply don't like making videos. I just don't enjoy it. It's not fun. It's not something that I have the temperament for. It's just not something I enjoy doing. I mean, think of it this way. Who am I, really? I'm just a guy, just a dude, sitting in a room talking about shit. And I'm not really talking about it particularly well, either. It might have been true that some time ago, when I had been producing content with a fair bit of regularity and consistency, I had developed a decent, serviceable amount of oratorial and rhetorical fluency, and I could speak extemporaneously without pausing too often, without umming and ahhing, and in a way that was at least bearable and decent enough to listen to. There'd been a certain kind of rhetorical standard established, and as is absolutely evident with the last video that I produced recently on UBI, my skills in that department, after having been away from making YouTube videos and speaking for extended periods of time for as long as I have declined rather sharply. The subject of that last video was a fairly simple one. It was one that could have been discussed and explained in a fairly short amount of time, and yet despite all of this, I found a way to drag that video out for over 55 minutes. Now, there's just no excuse for doing that. There's absolutely none. That did not need to be done. And yet it was. And I am as aware, as I'm sure all of you are, of all of my verbal tics. I have, in particular, an annoying tendency to repeat things that I've already said, rephrase them in other ways. And I do this because I am composing my thoughts on the fly as I sit down to record these videos, and so I have to throw up a certain amount of verbal subterfuge, if for no other reason than to just give me enough time to compose the next segment of my thoughts so that I can continue with whatever it is that I'm trying to say. And a certain amount of that, for rhetorical purposes, is even acceptable, but there are limits to it. There are phases where it just becomes annoying, it becomes cringy, it just becomes bad. And I'm fully aware of this. This is totally cringe. That awareness then, in a kind of feedback loop, ends up reinforcing even further my antipathy to making videos. And that's just sort of my situation here. Now, of course, I fully realize that if I were to sit down and place myself once again under the strain of having to produce fairly regular content, of having to retain fairly large amounts of information in my head, and of training myself to compose everything on the fly, extemporaneously, and just sort of getting back into the rhythm of doing that again, I'm fairly certain that eventually my ability to do so, at least serviceably, would return to me. So that in itself is not really a terrible problem. That's not something insurmountable. The question, however, is whether it is even worth doing this in the first place. And this is what brings me to the second reason why I've been away. When I started my Theological Origins of Modernity series, I had a certain vision. I had a certain something that I wanted to do, a certain ambition for those videos. And that, broadly speaking, began with the following thought. Looking around me, I find that we, living in the modern world, are in a predicament. We are in a very odd and bizarre situation. We see that the left wields absolutely ironclad cultural dominance over every institution of note in the West. And the left, because it has been able to wield this power for as long as it has been pushing its agenda unremittingly on the West for decades. This has worn down its social and cultural institutions and just essentially brought about quite a few baleful, terrible, destructive things. I mean, we're essentially at a point now where it is seriously contended by our elite that if we do not allow essentially limitless streams of transsexual illegal Mexican immigrants to hop across the southern American border and fuck American children in the ass while we provide said illegal immigrants with taxpayer-funded health care, then we're bigots. And we're expected to swallow this without complaint or without reaction. Recently there was a Democratic presidential candidate, albeit a small-time one that almost no one cares about, but a Democratic presidential candidate nonetheless, who seriously stood up on a debate stage and suggested that men could get pregnant and have children. This is the situation we're at. And of course, like many other people, I sat down and began wondering, okay, what the fuck is going on here? How the fuck did we come to this? And Jesus fucking Christ, what the hell can we do to get out of it? That was the initial thought prompting my explorations. And I believed that if I simply dived back far enough into intellectual history, that if I examined a sufficient number of ideas with enough care, with enough of a fine-tooth comb, I would finally at long last been able to find whatever it is that is at the root of this malaise in our culture. I would have been able to explain where things had gone wrong, and in so doing, I would finally have also been able to explain how to correct the mistakes that have been made, and not only to correct them, but to prevent those mistakes from being made again, to prevent them from reemerging. So, as I began recording those videos and conveying the things that I found, recounting the intellectual history that I recounted, I was able to do so with a fair amount of optimism and enthusiasm, and was able to overcome just the general antipathy that I have to sitting down and recording a video, because I believed that what I had been doing was valuable. It was something that needed to be put out there and explained, that it needed to be brought into the world, that the option of finding this and of learning these things needed to be available. People needed to find this. Even if it wasn't many people, it's just something that had to be put out there. Now, as time has gone by, that optimism has faded. One of the things that I have learned from studying intellectual history, among many other things, but one of the most important things certainly is that when cultures shift, when zeitgeists change, when regnant ideas cease to be dominant and are replaced by other sets of ideas, this very, very rarely, if ever, happens because the old set of ideas was conclusively refuted. That's just not how it works. Ideas are rarely, if ever, refuted in intellectual history. Instead, what happens is that a certain set of ideas forms the zeitgeist. It is regnant. It is dominant. The elites accept them. And because those who wield power accept them, and because those who wield power are used to wielding power, they become complacent, they become lazy. The ability that they have to defend the ideas on which their power and on which the existing cultural paradigm rests declines. And sooner or later, some weirdo, some outsider, some disaffected person, someone alienated from the society in which they find themselves, and who happens to have a fair amount of intelligence, realizes this and is able to criticize effectively those regnant ideas. He's able to poke holes in the set of ideas that holds up the culture in which he finds himself. And because the elite has grown complacent and lazy, they are not able to defend their set of ideas effectively. It's not because they can't be defended or because the criticisms of the critic aren't necessarily insightful or unanswerable. It's simply that a certain kind of intellectual listlessness has taken over. People have become complacent. They've become used to being in power, and therefore they are no longer able to effectively deal with challenges. And when the first group of alienated, disaffected weirdos discovers this, and when they learn that their criticisms cannot be answered well, they acquire more momentum. They acquire followers. Those followers amplify the original criticisms. They add additional criticisms, and this process continues to build and build until eventually the old order is toppled and replaced with something new. Now, upon initially toppling the old order, the elite that replaces the old elite is still of the sort that they're used to having to defend their ideas. They're used to having to refine them, to present them in intellectually sophisticated, nuanced, careful, and powerful ways. And so they're able to defend themselves well from criticism if criticism should ever come to meet them. However, with the passage of time, and with new elites emerging who have always known a world in which they are in power and who are therefore used to being in power, that new set of elites once again becomes complacent, and once again the process repeats itself where some disaffected, intelligent, but fundamentally weird outsider notices something about the culture that surrounds him and says, hey, this is fucking bullshit. And he goes around saying that it's fucking bullshit and finds that no one is able to answer him. And so the process repeats. And having noticed this pattern, I thought to myself, well, all right. Suppose I could criticize modernity effectively. Suppose that I could explain things like nominalism and other sorts of important theological ideas at the root of the modern world. Suppose I can criticize them effectively, and suppose that the paragons of the current culture, the current intellectual elites, suppose they're not able really to answer me well, and suppose that I or other people who have also been expounding similar ideas and similar criticisms are able to garner followings, and eventually the old order is toppled. Well, that's very nice, but how then is this new elite to prevent itself from growing complacent, from growing lazy, from weakening, and from eventually succumbing to the same forces that toppled the previous elite? How are we to escape this kind of cycle of history? And really, I don't have a good answer for this. To be perfectly frank with you, I just don't. And the more I observe intellectual discourse on YouTube and in other places, the more convinced I become that a good answer to this question will not be forthcoming. I mean, as I just said, look, I'm a dude who sits in a room and I babble on, and often enough my babbling is fucking cringe. The rhetorical presentation of the previous video that I uploaded was fucking trash. And I know it. I'm not fishing for compliments when I say this. It's just a simple fact. It just is that. I'm some cringy guy. And even if I were able to improve these holes in my presentation, and even if the ideas that I presented proved somehow to be convincing to a sufficient number of people, all I would be doing is instantiating the next phase in the kind of historical cycle that I had been describing. I would be propounding a set of ideas. Those ideas would become accepted. An elite, hypothetically, which believed in those ideas, would eventually, at some future date that I may or may not live to see, would take over. Those ideas would harden into orthodoxies. The elite would grow complacent, would be unable to answer criticism, and they would become cringe again. And the funny thing is that while this process normally in previous historical epochs would take decades or even centuries to fully play out, the internet has managed to hyper accelerate this process. Everything has become so much faster. You can propound ideas immediately and have them be criticized immediately. You can have good and bad aspects of everything exposed immediately. And the fact that some person or some faction on YouTube is fucking cringe can be exposed rather quickly and rather easily. So this circulation process is hyper accelerated. It happens way faster than it normally did. And when one sees this play out, one immediately comes to the obvious conclusion that everyone is fucking cringe. Everyone is fucking cringe. Everyone has blind spots in their ideas. Even intelligent people who try to discuss things in good faith, even they have blind spots. Even they're cringe, and even their critics are cringe, and the critics of their critics are cringe. And it's just a cycle of circle jerking cringe that just kind of goes on forever. And you could multiply examples of this virtually forever. Think of any major or even not major ideological faction. The liberals are cringe because, as I said, they are now seriously proposing that men can get pregnant, that they should be recognized as having the ability to get pregnant, and that transsexual illegal Hispanic immigrants should hop over the southern U.S. border in unlimited numbers and receive taxpayer-funded health care, even though they're not formally recognized as citizens of the United States. And anyone who objects to this is a bad person. Those people are cringe. The sort of mainstream Republican sort of MAGA wing of the of the Republican Party, they're fucking cringe. As Nick Fuentes and his groypers have exposed exquisitely well in recent weeks, these people are Israel first whores. They're grifters. They just all they want is status and the ability to sort of manipulate a blind braying horde of idiots and just sort of be able to circulate money and to have their stupid little sinecures and maybe even occasionally win elections, but never to do anything fundamentally about the culture, and always to be leftism driving the speed limit, leftism on a lag, leftism light, because, butt sex will really help us to win the culture war, obviously. Butt sex, and also constantly harping on how Israel is so permissive and allows butt sex. These are the important things. So these people are fucking cringe. The libertarians are fucking cringe. And I say this, by the way, as an ANCAP. I'm an anarchist. Okay, I am. I think politics is cancer and that the state should be abolished, and that the sort of property theory that libertarians, at least in the more sophisticated versions of their ideas, have presented, I think that these things are correct. And yet the Libertarian Party, as it exists today, is a fucking festival of disgusting cringe. You have, first of all, this boring, soulless, empty bureaucrat named Nick Sarwark, who occupies the chairmanship of the party, and who has fairly recently been on record saying that he is so utterly and exclusively concerned with winning elections that he is able and willing to sacrifice principle to any extent, basically saying that if Dick Cheney, hypothetically, were to run and win the nomination of the Libertarian Party, that all libertarians should support Dick Cheney and vote for him, regardless of the fact that he almost certainly believes in nothing that libertarians claim to stand for, and would betray principle on a whim, that he's just using them as a vehicle to elevate his own status, and nevertheless, here is Nick Sarwark saying, no, you should support this person. That's fucking cringe, bro. Like, it's fucking cringe. You're not gonna get anywhere with that. And the thing that makes it even more cringe is that the social ferment in the United States today is such that people are absolutely fed up with their political leaders. They hate them. They are desperately clamoring for ways to overthrow them. And so if someone could come across to them with a kind of radical, anti-elite, even revolutionary message, which would be able to clearly convey to them that, look, the elite that are in charge don't give a fuck about you. They're criminals. They want to destroy your culture. They want to destroy everything you stand for. They've been ripping apart the economy through the Federal Reserve and its ability to manipulate interest rates, create the business cycle, fund their endless, stupid wars that have only gotten Americans killed, that have only wasted trillions of dollars, and have only invited terrorist attacks to our shores. If someone could come along with a kind of radical message like this, which a decently formed libertarian party would certainly be able to do, they would acquire quite a bit of traction. They would make quite a bit of progress. And yet who is it that the Libertarian Party ends up nominating in 2016? Gary fucking Johnson, Mr. What is Aleppo, a guy that looked high when he showed up to most of his interviews, who doesn't know anything, who's just unimpressive and boring. This is what happens. These people are fucking cringe. They're cringe. And look, I could keep going. The Propertarians, Kurt Doolittle and his people surrounding him, they're fucking cringe. I really can't improve on the distributist summation of them. He said that propertarianism is basically objectivism for autistic boomers. And as a pithy line, I really can't do better than that. But if you've explored that set of ideas in any detail, you realize that one of the problems with them, and there are so many, but one of them is that Kurt Doolittle just doesn't understand what language is. He has drawn far too many spurious analogies between computer language and their rigid and formalistic structure and human languages, natural languages, which do not work in that way at all. And yet he thinks that you could devise some sort of consistent and universally applicable set of rules for judging truth claims that are expressed in human language, not realizing that human language is inherently vague, that it inherently depends on metaphor to function, and that therefore you cannot devise clear, unambiguous standards of precisely what in what circumstances does and does not constitute truth. And if you purport to do so and empower a group of people to do so, this will just turn into the exact same kind of ossified elite that we've had for thousands of years, and nothing essential will change. They'll just have a different story to justify their bullshit. And that's where we'll be. So nothing will change there. Those people are fucking cringe. The post-liberals and the neo-absolutists are fucking cringe because they don't even have arguments for their positions. They're not even attempting to justify what they believe. They're just sort of like, hey, power exists, people follow other people, and so therefore we shouldn't attempt to justify power because it just is. Well, that's fucking cringe. Because I mean, do you wanna live in a world like that? Seriously, think of the implications of that. Think of the implications of that kind of an absolutist world. Because what is the truth about politics? The truth about politics, fundamentally, and this is one way in which I am and really always have been significantly out of step with what might be called the dissident right here on YouTube. Politics, as I see it, is fundamentally the art of lying and of generating illusions with which to control the populace. That's what it's about. It is fundamentally based in deception. It is not an attempt to pursue the good. Such a thing, even if it were attempted, would not be possible and could not be sustained simply by the nature of what political power requires of all those who seek to gain it and to hold on to it. It's just not an approachable ideal. Now, at least the neo-absolutists are honest enough about this, and they say, look, we don't need to justify power. We don't need to even pretend that the actions of politicians are such that they benefit society, that what politicians do and the powers they have somehow help those over whom they rule or are somehow good for them. Power just exists, and that's it. Well, look, if you and Eric Orwell, or Erval, as I think he calls himself now, recently said, look, if you insist that reason is some kind of super sovereignty, and that therefore you shouldn't submit your political structures to it and shouldn't analyze them with it, well, then you can't really have a discussion, and it just becomes a matter of might is right, of whoever is stronger wins. And while there is, as I said, a certain kind of honesty to that, because it exposes just what the state really is and just what political power really is, it's cringe. It's fucking cringe, and it's a cringe that results from a kind of alienation with liberalism and with a weariness of all the terrible things culturally that liberals have done. And that leads them, therefore, to say, fuck all of this, fuck everything that liberalism ever purported to advocate, fuck the idea of rationally justifying political structures. We need to rip this whole thing out by the roots, because if we don't, if we allow this thing to get started, it will, so they allege, eventuate in this situation we have now, where we're all expected to allow unlimited numbers of transsexual illegal Mexican immigrants to cross the southern U.S. border and fuck American children in the ass while we provide them with taxpayer-funded health care. I mean, it's all cringe. What I'm trying to tell you is that you look around on YouTube, you look at all of these commentators, and they're all trying to sell you something. They're all hawking bullshit at you. They're all hawking ideologies at you. And I certainly don't exempt myself from any of this. I mean, look, not to wax all postmodern on you, but that really is it. I mean, someone is grifting. If it's not open, outright financial grifting, it's a kind of ideological grifting. It's, I'm going to induct you into my little cult, and let me ignore the little areas on the fringes where the ideology that I'm propounding doesn't really work so well, and I'm just going to spin out my little thing, and because I'm making videos on YouTube and I sound smart and I sound articulate, you're going to follow me. That's fucking stupid. I don't want to do that. I don't want to be just another guy hawking some bullshit and trying to sell you a story. And so when I tell you that I made a serious attempt to investigate something and dig down into the foundations of modernity and try to find a way to improve things, and I just haven't been able to do so, I'm going to tell you straight up, bluntly, I haven't been able to do so. Don't follow me. You know, you're stupid if you seek advice from me. If you want serious advice from me on important, weighty questions, you're barking up the wrong tree. I mean, I can sit down and have a discussion with you and tell you what I think about certain things, because I certainly have my opinions on many topics. But to regard me, or to regard anyone for that matter, as, you know, producing the final word on something as complex and intricate as human culture, on something as messy and ever churning as human history and its development. I mean, this is, it's born of a desire to escape the inherent and unavoidable complexities of the world, of a desire to find some ideology, to find some set of ideas, to find some set of answers in which you can comfortably ensconce yourself and then just be like, okay, this is it. I'm now safe from this crap. And I gotta tell you, I don't buy it. I don't think there's a way to escape human history. I don't think there's a way to abolish this. Even if the liberal order is overturned and replaced by something else, do you really believe that whatever it is that replaces it is not going to be cringy in its own way, is not going to have blind spots, weaknesses, aspects of it that don't cater to human nature, that don't mesh well with innate human desires? Do you really think that's going to happen? It won't. It will eventually be overthrown. Here's something about human nature that many on the distant right are loath to acknowledge. And that is that there is a certain amount of craving for chaos within the human soul. And the left caters to this. The left psychologically is such that it welcomes freaks and weirdos. And some of these freaks and weirdos might just be, homeless meth heads who babble on incoherently and have nothing interesting or important to say. And other freaks and weirdos might be people who take a genuinely different look at the world around them, and who, precisely because of their alienation and precisely because they insist on looking at things in a different way, in a way that offends the ordinary, make advances, make important discoveries, change the world, and so on. It's because the left is inherently welcoming to such people that they have the cultural dominance that they have. The ultimate movers and shakers of culture are weirdos, and the left is inherently welcoming of weirdos. That's just how it is. So, is the right going to be able to wrest control of the culture from the left? Maybe, temporarily. Because we are in this odd state of history where the left is dominant. And the left psychologically is such that it is supposed to be adversarial. And many of its members to this day, despite the obvious fact that they wield power, that they control society lock, stock, and barrel, nevertheless cannot divest themselves of their self-image as rebels. They think that they're fighting the system, that they're resisting Trump. We are the resistance and all this bull. Fuck that. No, you're not resisting anything. You're not the resistance. You're the man. And those people who are dissidents, who are weirdos, notice this, and in this weird circumstance of history in which we find ourselves, happen to ally themselves with the right. And because of that temporary alliance, it might ultimately prove the case that the right will in some sense wrest the culture from the left, but the pendulum will swing back the other way. Of course it will. Because the natural place of dissidence is on the left. It's different now because we're in a weird world, but things will swing back. And what do we do then? Do we simply resign ourselves to this constant, back and forth pendulum swinging forever? I, for one, don't want to do that. I, for one, don't see any value in that sort of a fatalistic game. What I see value in doing is trying to create things that wreak permanent changes on society. And here's what I mean by that. Cody Wilson, to give just one example, for those of you who don't know who he is the founder and CEO of a company called Defense Distributed. This company invented the first 3D printed gun called the Liberator. He's also created a machine which will assemble gun parts together and build a gun for you. And he's done this because he realized that while it is illegal to buy a gun and scratch off or otherwise remove the serial number from that gun, it is still legal to buy individual gun parts which have no serial numbers on them, and then combine those parts together and make a gun that way, which is essentially untraceable. But so he's doing sort of subversive things like this. Now this one idea of 3D printed weapons is enormously consequential, because if 3D printers become sufficiently advanced, sufficiently widespread, sufficiently inexpensive and affordable, this will enable the ordinary individual to manufacture deadly arsenals in his own garage quickly and at low cost. Once this becomes widespread, the population will essentially be able to say to the elite, hey, look, the balance of power between us has shifted irrevocably. We have the power to kill you fuckers now. Okay? We have, fuck elections, fuck all this bullshit. We're armed to the teeth. And you can't stop us from being armed to the teeth. Confiscate one of our guns, we don't care. We'll make 10 more in its place. What are you going to do? Go to every house and confiscate every 3D printer? What if 3D printing becomes an integral part of the economy, which it's sure to do once it becomes developed technology? Are you just going to destroy the economy and remove this potential for economic growth from it? You do realize, of course, that the state's tax revenue comes from economic growth. And so in attempting to prevent the spread and flowering of these technologies, they would ultimately be hurting themselves. And so the elite will be at a crossroads. You either allow the permanent distribution of something like 3D printed guns and thereby accept a permanent diminution in their power, or they attempt to crack down on the technology, risk failing to do so, and even if they succeed, do permanent economic damage to their societies and essentially allow themselves to be left behind economically by those countries which take a different course. And the same could be said for the internet, which has distributed information to an enormous and extraordinary degree and has discredited so many official mainstream news sources. Nobody fucking believes CNN anymore. Come on. We all know they're full of shit. We all know they're lying. We can go to all sorts of different websites and we can learn things that are not being fed to us by the mainstream media. As this grows, people will become more and more aware of the horrible, evil, skeevy shit that the elite is up to. And they will progressively come to realize what I said earlier about politics, that politics is the art of manufacturing lies and illusions and using them to control the population. They will slowly realize that every group of elites is full of shit, that every one of them is power hungry, that every one of them eventually comes to be seduced by the blandishments of power, and that they will become ensconced in an area that will close them off from the rest of their subjects and lead them to essentially not give a shit about them. Now, this might not have been a terrible problem in times when the elite was able to control the flow of information and form the zeitgeist more or less well. But with the internet, that's not possible anymore. I mean, why do you think that Elizabeth Warren and Kamala Harris and all of these other senators are so upset at Mark Zuckerberg and demanding that he and that the executives at Google police online content more stringently, that they do not allow people to spread lies, quote-unquote lies, on their platforms? Why do you think this happens? Is it because, is it? Do they want to regulate Facebook and YouTube because they're so concerned about right-wing voices being deplatformed? Pal, if you believe that, you'll believe anything. No, these people are worried because, as evidenced by the 2016 election of Donald Trump, the internet has the power to make things happen that the elite do not want to happen. Donald Trump was not supposed to win the election. He was not supposed to become the president. And so now, when Elizabeth Warren and her ilk gather around Mark Zuckerberg and they say to him that he had better do more work to prevent lies from spreading on Facebook, what she is essentially saying to him is, because of you disruptive fucks in Silicon Valley, this orange asshole was able to get into the White House. You better fix this shit right now. You better prevent it from happening again. And Mark Zuckerberg, of course, is not 20 years old anymore. He's not a disruptor anymore. He's established. He's the man. He's risen to power. He's a multi-billionaire. Facebook is a brand now, and he has an empire to defend. And since he doesn't like Trump either, he will see the threat of regulation looming over him by these politicians. He will sit down and he will say, you know what? I think I can work with this. Fine, regulate Facebook. Great. In fact, it would benefit Zuckerberg to do that, because a series of regulations over Facebook, or the internet more generally, would simply ossify and freeze in place the structure of companies that currently exists there. Zuckerberg would love that. But the blockchain threatens to append all of that, and that's why it's so dangerous. A project like Skycoin, for example, or Minds, which I haven't read the white paper for Minds, so I don't know about it in much detail, but I know at least this much. I know that it is a blockchain-based social media platform, and because it is blockchain-based, it is such that it is not possible for the company Minds to simply deplatform users or delete their accounts because they say something that the proprietors or owners of the company don't like. You can't simply alter blockchains. Once a block on a blockchain has been established and the progression is moved to the next block, you can't undo the blockchain without commandeering an enormous amount of computing power. And as blockchains grow in size, because remember, each blockchain depends on all the previous blockchains before it. Its identity is in part a product of the identities of all those previous blocks. And so if you were to change any one block on the blockchain, you have to also change all the previous blocks. As blockchains grow large, the computing power necessary to do this becomes prohibitively large, and therefore implementing changes like this will become effectively impossible. Basically, the punchline is it's impossible to deplatform people off of blockchain-based social media platforms. You can't do that anymore. So the power of Google or Facebook, with its massive centralized servers to destroy users who are saying things they don't like, once this stuff takes off, it's gone. That ability is eliminated forever, and the balance of power between ordinary people and the elite changes permanently and irrevocably. This is, I cannot overstate how revolutionary this is. And if the elite is able to swoop in while this technology is still in its infancy and impose regulations on the internet, under the guise of breaking up the tech monopolies and allowing the common man access to the public square, all that's going to do is it's going to ossify the state of technology forever, and it's not going to allow these revolutionary technologies to develop. And that's worrying because, as I've just described, these technologies, once developed, have the power to permanently upend what the elite is doing. So why am I describing all of this? I'm describing it because that seems like a much better thing for me to do than to sit around and babble about things on YouTube in a cringy way, in a way that isn't terribly clear, that isn't terribly articulate, that has me repeating things and stumbling over my words. I would rather work in an area where I might actually be able to make a difference rather than here. I feel that my talents, my abilities could be better better employed elsewhere. And look, I really feel a strong urge to sort of gush about all of these new developments because they're really extraordinary, and it probably deserves a separate video at some point, which I might make. But the most revolutionary of all of these are things like Blockstack and Skycoin. Skycoin in particular, because it's a total redesigning of the very structure and architecture of the internet down to the very hardware. And if it's developed enough and widespread enough, it will eventually allow you to circumvent the telecom companies. They'll become unnecessary. You'll be able to start up a decentralized network and essentially just have an internet without having to pay the telecom companies for it. Now, can you imagine how hard these people, these corporations will fight to maintain their power, to maintain their position once Web 3.0 via things like Blockstack and Skycoin begins to develop and grow and scale? It's going to be crazy. But this is the next step. It's the next move in social evolution. It is the next development which will permanently alter the very nature of socio-political reality. And that, I think, has far more power and far more potential than anything that a mere political activist or YouTube commentator or influencer can do. So that's it. That's your answer. That's why I haven't been making videos.